Hello, good evening. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about the heart and blood and how that works. So first, I wanted to start off explaining something called the pressure volume curve. The pressure volume curve is a way that we can kind of visualize how pressure and volume are related in the left ventricle and how when one changes, it affects the other. So first, I want to draw out kind of a similar one to the cardiac cycle graph. Um, just draw that here. So here we'll have time. Then I'm going to say left ventricle volume right here and left ventricle pressure right here. And then we'll just draw a dotted line in between the two, separating them. So let's say we start right here. Draw this. And okay, so first of all, let's mark some landmarks here. So this point right here, in red, I'm going to be using to show when a valve closes. So here we have our bicuspid closing. And here we're going to have our semilunar closing. If we draw some dotted lines, then it's easier to see where this is happening. So what's happening here? Our bicuspid valve is going to close. So before this point right here, the volume was slowly increasing. The bicuspid valve closes because the pressure in the ventricle is higher than the pressure in the the atrium. So the bicuspid valve closes. We get our isovolumic contraction. So the pressure is going up, the heart is contracting. Eventually, that pressure gets above the pressure of the aorta, and what happens? The semilunar valve is going to open. Semilunar opens. So let's draw a little dotted line through here. Right when that semilunar valve opens, as you can see below, the volume is going to decrease because the blood is exiting the ventricle. And then semilunar is going to eventually, all the blood is shot out. The pressure will be higher in the aorta than the ventricle, and the semilunar valve is going to close. And once it closes, we're going to have isovolumic contraction here. So, and then right here is going to be where our bicuspid reopens. So usually we can divide these into 4 different phases: A, B, C, and D, and then back to A over here. So A is going to be our diastolic filling. So our ventricles can relaxing, and it's going to be passively filling up with blood coming in from the atrium. In B, that's going to be our isovolumic contraction. This is where pressure is increasing, the heart's contracting, but volume is not changing. Then C is going to be our ejection of blood. And then D is going to be our isovolumic relaxation. Relaxation. Now, there's another way that we can map this out that doesn't have the time axis. It's just going to have the volume and pressure axes. And so it's going to be kind of another way to look at this. So if we draw another two axes here, over here we're going to have pressure, and over here we're going to have volume. Pressure and volume in the left ventricle. So let's start at this point here. Here we'll say is when the bicuspid first opens, so the diastolic filling is going to happen. So volume in the left ventricle is going to slowly be increasing as blood enters. At some point, we're going to get contraction, and we're going to get the closing of that bicuspid valve, and we're going to have our isovolumic contraction here. As we go up, eventually the semilunar valve is going to open, so volume will decrease, but pressure will continue to increase for a while. And it'll kind of top out, and then eventually the semilunar valve is going to close, the aorta is going to be cut off, and we'll go back to decreasing in pressure. That's our isovolumic relaxation. So we can kind of mark the same landmarks on here, so the heck. So this is bicuspid open. And then up here would be semilunar opens. Up here, semilunar closes. And bicuspid closes. And what's happening, we can match up these A, B, C, and D. So right here is going to be our diastolic filling. So that would be A. Up here is going to be our isovolumic contraction. So that'll be B. On the top here, this is all going to be our ejection. So that'll be C. And then from here to here, that's going to be D. That's going to be our isovolumic relaxation. So it's just a different way to show how pressure and volume are changing. And the reason we like it is because the distance, there's a couple other things we can measure when we do the graph in this way in the pressure volume curve. One thing that we can measure is something called stroke volume. Stroke volume. And stroke volume is basically the amount of blood that is going to be pumped out of the heart at any time. So that actually is a perfect, and usually if we were to give these labels, we would say this is about 50 milliliters, and we would say this is about 120. So usually you're going to have about 70 milliliters of stroke volume, and that's going to be basically what stroke volume is going to be the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. So really interesting there. There's a couple other things that we can see from these graphs. Something called inotropy, which is the intensity of the heartbeat or the contractility of the heart. So how intensely the contraction happens. So if we draw another one of these graphs over here, and then we do like a control, increasing, boom. So this would be our normal, and the inotropy is going to be measured from here to here. So this is our inotropic line, and the slope of it is going to tell us if it's a steeper slope, it'll be more inotropic, and a less steep slope will be less inotropic. And that just means that there's going to be more contraction. If we were to go inside the heart into the wall of the ventricle and push on it, the harder the contraction, the more stiffness or the more elasticity it's going to have. So that's just something that we can measure when we look at our inotropy. Another thing that we can look at here, I'll just highlight it in green, is something called our afterload. Afterload is the resistance that the heart needs to overcome to be able to pump blood out of the ventricle. So if we've got more blood pressure, more say vasoconstriction, then it's gonna be more afterload. So for example, if afterload were to increase, we could draw another one of these curves like this. The inotropy will stay the same contractility, but you're going to have to increase the pressure to be able to expulse all of that same volume. And same thing if the afterload is decreased or if there's less pressure, then we can go up and not go as high. Pressure decreases and we're able to get out more volume. Um, so yeah, that's what afterload is. And then preload, we'll just draw another graph for that. Preload is going to be the amount of stretch in the cardiac sarcomeres before they contract. So if we map that out here, let's draw a control. It's pretty bad, but and then we'll draw two examples. So in the red example, we're going to have decreased preload. So what that's saying is we're going to have less blood for the heart to pump out, and because of that, there's going to be less blood pumped out, obviously. And then in the green is going to increase preload, so there's more venous return, say, and that means we're just going to pump more preload out. Notice how this does not have an effect on the inotropy line, which means we don't have to recruit more calcium depending on how much blood enters the heart. No matter how much blood enters the heart, we're always able to pump it out with the same amount of calcium in the heart. And that's called the Frank-Starling mechanism. So you're able to pump everything out that comes in. Next here, let's talk about some of the ways that blood pressure is regulated. And that has to do with something called the mean arterial pressure. The mean arterial pressure, let's draw another graph here. Lots of graphs that are helpful to kind of illustrate what's going on. So we have on one axis, again, the pressure. Draw that smaller pressure. The other axis we're going to have um, here just a couple different structures. So we've got our aorta, our arteries, arterioles, capillaries, and at the end, veins. So we're going to have this main line that represents our mean arterial pressure. Okay, so this is our mean arterial pressure, and as you can see here, the pressure is going to be highest in the aorta, decrease a little in the arteries. As it gets onto the arterioles, it starts to really decrease, and then when it goes through the capillaries, it'll be most decreased, and by the time it gets to the veins, there's almost going to be no blood pressure. So it's going to start out the highest at the aorta. And what's really happening here is we're going to have these kind of fluctuations, kind of like this. And this is the difference in systolic and diastolic pressure. So we'll say systolic, and then down here, diastolic. So basically, when the heart pumps, the heart is contracting, obviously the blood pressure is going to increase. And then when it relaxes, it's obviously going to decrease. And so when they say your blood pressure is 120 over 80, that means that the systolic pressure on the top is 120 and the diastolic on the bottom is 180. And so the mean arterial pressure is going to be the average of those two blood pressures over time. Obviously, the heart is relaxed for more time than it's contracted, so it's going to be closer to the diastolic pressure, and it's going to go on decreasing. And one of the ways that we're able to regulate this blood pressure is through something called the baroreceptor or baroreceptor reflex. The baroreceptor reflex, its job is to make sure that there's sufficient blood pressure to ensure blood flow to all of the body, all of the organs. And it's a feedback loop, so there's going to be 5 components like usual. So let's kind of draw it out down here. We'll start out with our heart, and then the aorta coming from the heart. We'll zoom in here. We have our 3 branches here, and then an extra branch. So what's going to happen is our baroreceptors are actually going to be located in the aortic arch and in the carotid or carotid sinuses. Sinuses are going to be our baroreceptors. They're going to be located there, and what the baroreceptors are doing, they're actually stretch receptors. So they're going to be sensing a stretch in the wall of the arteries. So anytime there's increased blood pressure, that's going to increase stretch, which will cause the baroreceptors to send action potentials up to the brain. So this is when our afferent pathway comes into play. So there's going to be 2 cranial nerves. Right here, I'm just going to draw over that. For the carotid sinuses, is going to be cranial nerve 9, and for the aortic arch, it's going to be the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. They're going to go up to the medulla of the brain. Draw a little brain here. some squiggly lines. It's a good brain. And here's our medulla. This is going to be our control center. So if the blood pressure is increasing and we sense that, the medulla is going to use parasympathetic or sympathetic fibers that go back to our effector organ, which is the heart. So say our blood pressure has increased for whatever reason. What the medulla is going to do, it's going to send a signal through these parasympathetic fibers, and that is going to calm the heart down, cause the heart rate to decrease a little bit. And the exact would be true for the opposite. If blood pressure is decreasing, then the sympathetic fibers would cause the heart rate to increase if oxygen is not sufficient to the body. One example of this is when you stand up too fast. If you stand up super fast, sometimes you'll get lightheaded, but a lot of times you don't, because the baroreceptors so quickly sense a decrease in blood pressure that they immediately send a message up, and we get vasoconstriction and an increase in heart rate, and blood is able to be sent more quickly up to the brain. So that's a little bit about how it's regulated. Now let's talk about the capillaries. So the capillaries are very interesting. They're where the arteries and the veins connect to each other. So let's just draw out. This is kind of what they look like. And first of all, how is pressure regulated in the capillaries? Because obviously blood pressure in the arteries is changing all of the time. It's increasing, decreasing, depending on what's happening. So we're going to have actually a sphincter here that's going to, depending on what the blood pressure is out here, it's increased or decreased, our sphincter is going to contract or relax so that the blood pressure in the capillaries stays the same, usually around 30 millimeters of mercury. So I just kind of want to zoom in on this part of the capillary here, and we're going to kind of draw out what the driving forces of fluids are in the capillary. So let me just draw this out. So this is going to be our arterial end, and this is our venous end. And then this will be inside the capillary. And then this is something called our interstitial fluid, which is just the fluid right outside of the capillaries. So we have our capillary membrane here, and there's a couple different driving forces. The first one is the one we just mentioned, is the hydrostatic pressure, which is the pressure inside the arterioles. This is driving fluid out of the out of the capillaries, out into the interstitial fluid. And like I mentioned, it is 30 millimeters of mercury. Another force that is pushing fluid out is something called IFP, the interstitial fluid pressure. That's going to be 3 out. And the reason for this is because we have a lymph node for the lymphatic system, and that lymph node is going to be picking up excess water. And so when it picks up that excess water, that's kind of creating a net pressure out of the capillary. Two other things. We have a force inward of 28, and that's something called BCOP. BCOP is the blood colloidal osmotic pressure. And what that basically means is there's these proteins called albumin in the blood. And so those proteins are going to cause osmosis to want water to balance the concentration of albumin inside with the outside the cell. So water is going to want to come into the cell. So that's a big driving force into the cell. We also have ICOP, which is interstitial fluid, colloidal osmotic pressure. That's going to be driving out of the cell because there actually are a bunch of proteins in the interstitial fluid that are causing water through osmosis to want to leave the capillary to the interstitial fluid. So what we can do here is to see the net drive of fluid in the arterial end of the capillary. We can add all of these up. So if we make a little, I like to call this in and out because that's my favorite burger. So our in, we have blood colloidal osmotic pressure, that's 28. Out, we have our hydrostatic pressure, which is 30, our interstitial fluid pressure, which is 3, and we have our interstitial fluid colloidal osmotic pressure, which is 8, I believe. Yeah, 8. So when we add all of these up, there's a net driving force of 13 out of the cell. So right when the blood first comes in here, fluid is going to be pushed out of the capillaries. Some of it's going to be picked up by the lymph node, but some of it is actually going to come back. And so that's what we're going to look at with the venous end. So as blood, let's just picture blood traveling down the capillary. As blood travels down, lots of fluid leaves. The pressure over on the venous end is actually going to be a lot less than on the arterial end. So our hydrostatic pressure, let's draw some blue, is still going to be out of the cell, but it's only going to be 10 millimeters of mercury. Our IFP is similarly also going to be 3, same as before. Our BCOP is still going to be 28 into the cell. And our ICOP is still going to be 8 out of the cell. So if we do the math here, with our in and out graph, in, out, our BCOP is still 28. Hydrostatic pressure is now only 10. IFP 3. ICOP 8. So our net here is going to be 7 millimeters of mercury into the cell. So fluid is going to leave the cell, but most of it's going to come back in. The rest that's not leaving, that doesn't come back in, is going to be picked up by these lymph nodes and recycled through the body. When that fluid does not, when there's too much buildup of fluid in the interstitial fluid, we have a condition that is called edema. So one example that we can talk about with edema is an increase in hydrostatic pressure. So usually, if we look here, our hydrostatic pressure is going to be 30 HP is going to be 30, right? And that's thanks to this sphincter right here that's maintaining that. But if our systolic blood pressure is going to, if that stays above a super high number such as 160, so if it's out above 160 out here, eventually that can override and push enough pressure in, even though the sphincter is there, to cause our hydrostatic pressure to go up. So if we think about that on our in and out graph, if our hydrostatic pressure, let's say we change our hydrostatic pressure to something like, I don't know, 45. So we're adding 15. So 15 plus 13, 28. So now we would have a 28 millimeters of mercury force going out of the cell. And sure, a lot of that will still come back in, but that's going to cause a big buildup of fluid in our interstitial fluid. And not the lymph node can't pick all of that up. So what that'll cause is our edema, and that can cause some buildup of fluid in the skin, cause kind of puffy, swollen looking skin. But yeah, that's how our blood is regulated. And that is a little bit about the heart. I'm so glad that you took the time to listen to this. I hope you have a great night. We'll talk to you later. Bye.